Hello fellow engineers, and welcome back to Factorio. My name is Nasty. Today's episode is the first episode of the Purple Science competition. I'm super excited to talk through this episode today. There's 30 designs that have been submitted for this. These designs are very unique in their design choices and how they go about going and actually crafting from raw inputs and the absolute sea of stone that you have to consume and steel to craft ultimately these wonderful things here called rails and go into Purple Science. So Purple Science is notorious for being one of the most painful to create of all sciences, at least traditionally in 1.0, and then also kind of for Space Age there's some debate on what's the best. This is one of the hardest to optimize and to go through and design, because there's so many decisions you have to make in terms of how you're going about designing these builds. These 30 designs that have been submitted are all extremely unique, and they deploy different strategies. Now, I'll talk through some of the different overall methods here in the next part. First, I want to give an overview of this baseline build, why I designed it the way that I did, and why this is the baseline and why I'm considering it this way. So let's start with that. What you're seeing in front of you now is the baseline design. One of the reasons that I chose this design to be used is A, I don't have to go and really redesign a whole new build, because if you followed my channel for any amount of time, you know that I've already created a series where I talked about making uncommon quality science for Purple Science. This is exactly the same build. The only difference is that we are only needing 2 foundries to produce, or really 4 foundries to produce the entire amount of steel that we are fully going to need for 240 items per second, compared to the sea of furnaces that you would normally need for this if you were using traditional furnaces. Everything else in the design is exactly the same, and the reason I chose it was because I wanted to just see how it performs in comparison, because once you go to normal quality science, immediately you have the ability to have steel foundries like this that make 356 items per second, whereas an individual furnace at 300% productivity is going to max out at just over 30 items per second that one individual legendary electric furnace can actually produce for steel. And it also needs a second one that's producing iron right next to it, daisy chained into it. So order of magnitude difference, literally 2 orders or 1 order of magnitude, so literally a 10x throughput that you can do from one foundry. And you're reducing an extra assembly machine and inserter from that. So it's a large change. Now, that being said, the other reason that I chose this was that, besides the fact that I'm relatively lazy and didn't want to completely redesign a whole new build from scratch, was that this also demonstrates probably the worst case scenario. And what I mean by that, so the highest flow rate items in this build are going to be green circuits. Well, actually technically it'd be copper wire that's going to be the highest, but you shouldn't be belting that anyway. But if let's say, like, for specifically for green circuits, that's a high flow rate that's going to be coming here, because we need a lot more red circuits now. But the by far the highest flow rate item is going to be stone and steel. Traditionally, Purple Science has always been an absolute pain to design, and it's all because of how do you get enough rails and enough throughput to get the constant consumption that you need. I mean, just look at this, like, per minute, this is going to make almost 10,000 rails, and it's going to consume, 4,000 plus stone and steel per minute. So it is a very expensive in terms of raw resources, and steel is also not so cheap to make if you're not using foundry, right? So in Space Age now, this is significantly easier to do because we have access to foundries. So I chose this to say, all right, I'm just going to belt the steel. I'm going to use that as the baseline, and we'll see just how expensive it is to have inserters constantly pulling up from an individual belt like this, and constantly pulling both stone and steel alternating in this way. So I chose it for that reason, and this is going to be our baseline, and any design that goes and performs better than the baseline will move on to the next round. And in reality, you should be able to pretty easily optimize further from this design that I have here, because this is still using all the same limitations that I had, other than now having access to foundries that got swapped out that I had when I was making the uncommon design of choice for this. So with that, let me talk through some individual strategies here next so that you can understand why you can make some quick, easy choices to already just immediately optimize this without having to do any kind of circuit control or anything else. Like, just what are some of the layout and design choices you can make right off the bat. So the method that I just showed a second ago is constantly pulling items off of a belt and throwing them into an assembly machine here. So I chose this specific speed configuration because these will consume 80 items per second and will craft 160 items per second. So the maximum rate that a legendary stack inserter can pull off a belt is 80 items per second, and also can drop is 80 items per second. And direct insertion is 120, so you'll see that this will occasionally stop where the other ones are constantly running. So that being said, where I'm going with this is this operation, pulling items constantly off a belt, is one of the highest entity update times, is just these stack inserters constantly scanning a belt, pulling the items off. So this is already just a overall bad approach to crafting the actual assembly machines. Now, why is this? Why would you choose this? Well, practically, it's convenient to belt in stone from whatever patch you need, and then make all the molten metals on site or wherever you are, and then you can just belt the stone across the map wherever you need it to be, and you can feed it directly into your particular build. That has the convenience of centralizing where your purple science production is going to be, and you'll be able to more easily connect all your molten fluids, all of your like your plastics, your coal. Like, you can be a little bit more flexible with it. Now, this is the design choice that you would be normally that you could make. The easy option, where you're still belting in stone, the immediate improvement you could do is just direct inserting steel. This is immediately just going to eliminate this one expensive inserter from constantly picking up, and now you just have one stone stack inserter that's going to be putting items into the assembly machine. This is already going to be a pretty decent like improvement immediately that you could have just for this exact same setup. That requires almost no effort because of just the foundries that we have access to. Like, I don't have to over beacon this or anything. This is plenty and is constantly stopped here, constantly output blocked here. We are overproducing well beyond what we actually need. Now, what you're going to notice on a lot of designs is they take this one step further. They say, let's eliminate this expensive stack inserter altogether, and let's just directly mine, use an electric mining drill, directly into one of these assembly machines. Because in this competition, I've given everyone access to mining productivity level 8,000. Now, you don't need this high of a mining productivity in order to get the electric mining drill to actually perform for this. It's just, this is way over the actual production rate that you're going to need, because you only need 80 items per second. So this is 2,000 per second extra than we actually need. So this will basically be stopped all the time, right? So this, though, is going to be more optimal in general because you're eliminating an inserter for a high flow rate item. So this makes sense to do. This has a drawback, though, and the drawback is the amount of space now you need, because you're going to have to plant this design on top of an actual patch. And patch sizes change significantly between your spawn settings. You'll see a lot of megabasers, including myself, we choose to use world spawn settings where the actual terrain, normally the size, is cranked up to absolutely the maximum at 600%. Now, not everyone wants to play that way. So for the point of this competition, I'm breaking up all of these different designs into a few different categories. The first category is going to be all of your any percent designs. That means that you're belting in stone, like you're seeing here on the left-hand side. That's going to work for 100%, 50%, 30%, 600%, doesn't matter, because we're belting it in. We don't care about placement. There's also going to be designs then that are going to be on patch. So for the on patch designs, so where they are direct mining into the what is this called? Why can't I think of it? Into the actual assembly machine crafting the rails. That's going to be broken up in a couple categories. Now, the designs that have been submitted are on 3 different settings. So they're on the 100% size, they're at 200%, and they're at 600%. So those 3 different categories for on patch are going to be independently tested, and we're going to compare them in isolation. So when we design this, you may want to opt for this design strategy depending on your playstyle, and that's cool. Now, if you want to go for the absolute max UPS that you can get, you're going to have to crank your map generation settings to have larger stone patches, because you're just going to fit so many more of these electric mining drills onto that one patch, and you can produce more science and share more beacons from those layouts. But that's not everyone's design choice or style to how to play the game. So for that, each designer has chosen a different way to do that, and those are going to be tested independently. So that is the biggest reason why we have those 3, or I'll say 4 independent categories for testing, because they create very large differences between those designs, which we'll see when we explore the results later. So that is an overview on some of the different tactics for creating rails themselves. Here's an example of a design that has come out of this competition already. So we'll talk to this design at a later point and whose design it actually is, but I thought it was a really good example of what you can do given the limitations of the default size of a stone patch. So a default size like this is going to kind of showcase here where we can get a decent amount of miners directly on here. So we can get 4 stone miners. But if you want to actually, how much can you actually produce out of this one patch doing it this way? Well, you're going to see here that the equivalent is we're going to get about 144 per second. So we can not really saturate a belt at all doing it this way. So in order to actually get to even close to 2 belts of this, we're going to need 3 of these stone patches that you're seeing here in front of you. And that's going to be producing up to 432 items per second, but that's still not the full stacked belt, right? Because that'd be 480 that you'd have to be targeting per second to get 2 stacked belts out of this. That means that you need 4 patches on a default map to be able to produce just 2 lanes of purple science. So it becomes more of a logistics problem of routing all the materials, especially these 2 materials, your electric furnaces and your productivity modules, all to all the different patches that you're going to have in a default setting. So for that reason, at 100% patch size setting, you're going to have a much more difficult time logistically laying out all of these on patch stamped designs in order to actually go and create it. So that default setting, this is it presents its own challenge, which is just finding enough patches. You'd have to explore a lot more of the base, have to potentially expand where they're all going to be, and so that's a different problem. So that's something that I want to also just highlight here before we get into the result, because in theory, again, we're eliminating a very high flow through item, and we're maximizing direct insertion this way, and this should be better, without a doubt. Because just, again, we're limiting that stack inserter that is picking up from a belt is just going to be better. But at 100% patch, this is going to have some drawbacks. Now, I'm going to showcase here 3 different patches. So in this competition, what you just saw was the 100% patch design. That is what you're seeing there on the left-hand side. So that is what you're going to have access to if, on average, this is what we figured out is how big the patches are going to be at different spawn settings, what you're going to get. Now, the moment that you kick up to 200% size, well, you can see just how much more room there is here now for you to be able to create a different layout. So now your design choice of your on-patch design could be significantly larger, right? So you can see just by comparison. And then finally, when we get to 600%, well, you can see just how many of these we could potentially fit on this one block here and be able to share more beacons like this. And you can kind of get the idea that now I would change my layout here significantly if I'm running at 600%. right? Because now I can totally change how big of or how many items we're getting. Because now out of one patch, we can easily get over the 240 items per second that we need. So that is its own kind of decision that you have to make when you're getting into mega basing, is what size of patch size settings are you going to have for your world? And it's going to impact you in the early game for sure, but especially in the late game, because it limits your design choices that you can have when you only have access to the default patch sizes. So my recommendation for the way that I particularly play the game is I play at 600% patch sizes because I'm trying to push the game to its absolute limits and what we can feasibly do with it. Now, that might not be your play style. So for that reason, the designs are all incorporating these different patch size limitations so that we can get an understanding of what you can do at these different patch sizes when it comes to directly on patch mining stone and producing the rails that we're going to need. Okay, I think that's enough of an intro. Let's go and talk through the designs next. All right, so the page that you're seeing in front of you is going to be posted on my GitHub. I always post this. This is going to be an overview of all the results and all the metrics and everything in my written version of this, so that in the future, if instead of watching a longer form content video on this, you can just go and refer back to any of the notes or anything that I've taken. Because like the whole goal for this and the why I do this in the first place is so that we can build better mega bases as a whole community, and that's why I'm doing it. So I don't care if you watch the whole entire video, and honestly, if you just want to go and read all the notes here and that's all you need, just go feel free to do that. That's why they're there. You'll get a little bit more of insights from what I think about designs and maybe some ways that I might think like a certain design might get better or improve, and some thoughts for the future if you watch the whole video. But honestly, you could get a lot of the same content if you go and just read some of the things that I have, and just not maybe as in depth as I'm actually going to go in a more long form video content and me talking about it. So this is always going to be posted. It's going to be the link in the video description below. You can go and see them along with all the designs themselves, what their individual blueprints production rate was designed for, and then also the save file if you want to open up the save file yourself and look at the benchmark and see the design running in at least in any of the benchmarks that were performed in the video that you're going to see today. So we're going to dive directly into the actual results here next. First, I just want to talk about a couple things. What I've done is I asked all the designers to go and create a save file that made 960 items per second, and they all graciously did that. So first, thank you to everyone who wound up going and creating a file. That saved me a lot of time. The second thing is I indicated in the form if it's an on-patch design, they had to say yes or no to that and indicate that in the results here. So there's a couple cases where they're doing both. So in that case, I've opted towards just saying, yes, they are on patch, but we'll kind of try to compare that, as it's weird when they're doing a hybrid approach for both because they don't fall neatly into a category. So with that being said, there are going to be a few categories that kind of emerge from this, because the other item, like we talked about, is the patch size is going to influence how much they're actually going and doing a direct on the site mining and on patch designs. So I'm going to be breaking this down really just to make things a little bit simpler. I'm breaking this down a little bit further than just like the percent, but I'm going to compare them just on the percent basis is mainly how I'm going to approach this. So there's 4 categories in total. There is the any percent that is belted. So they're belting the stone. The second category is going to be the any percent, sorry for the zoom there, that is going to be on patch. And then there's 200% plus that's going to be on patch and 600% plus that are on patch. So there were more available, but the designers chose to fall into one of these categories for the way that they wound up designing everything. Now, the gross majority of all the designs are at default settings, 100% patch size, and are going to be belting in the stone. So that is the majority of the case. There's a good number of on-patch designs, but for the most part, we have most of the designs are 100% and they're belting in things. One exception that I have at the moment is this design number 16 by T's. And I need to correct this, this is actually true. So this design actually goes and belts in and has an on-patch. So again, for that reason, I'm going to prefer just saying that this is an on-patch design, but it's doing both. So it's kind of, maybe we can learn something from that. But anyway, so realizing I need to change this 1 second. Sorry for that quick interruption. So these different designs are, for the most part, going to be belted. Now, let's just jump right into the actual results and talk about them. So what you're seeing first here, this very first chart, is going to be a chart that reflects the whole update time distribution across all the runs. So for the runs that we did, we copied all the designs. We copied them 12 times at 960 per second. So they're producing from the original save files. I wound up going and region cloning them all. And I made sure I disabled the global electric network and then had made sure that they all were under one electric network when I set it up. And there are 12 copies of it. So for a total of 960 times 12, well, 11 copies, 12 copies, and then the original one was deleted, is how I exactly set it up. But that's going to be 11,520 per second or 691,200 per minute. That got me easily into the over 2 milliseconds of update time, and you'll see that in the actual benchmarks. But that was the initial, the amount of copies that you're seeing. So when you're seeing the MS values on my particular CPU, which is a 7800X3D, you're going to see those MS values in terms of them producing 691,200 raw purple science per minute, which is a huge number. So just keep that in mind. So the run distribution is the 6 runs that were run over 18,000 ticks. 18,000 ticks is 5 minutes. So over the course of 5 minutes, we sampled these for an initial run. So the idea here was to go and say, let's go and take the baseline design and let's find all the designs that are above it. Unfortunately, fortunately for me, 2 things happened. Fortunately, what you're seeing here is that the overall run distributions are pretty close. Like I said, my particular CPU has some cores that are better than others, and so that's where you're going to see whenever the main thread for Factorial locks onto a core that is either better or worse than another, you're going to see this variance in the actual runs. Overall, a much longer benchmark is going to basically deal with all of the problems that we have in terms of variance. So when we run the longer benchmark for the next round, that's going to solve that problem. Now, moving on, I'm going to go talk about all the designs right away. So when I was saying unfortunately versus fortunately, all the designs pretty much, except for one design, performed above the baseline. Now, to be fair, used design specifically has a big outlier. I don't know if you can tell what it is, but if you watch the chemical science video, he produced a train design. And he did the exact same thing this time around. So the reason I find this one particularly interesting, I'll make a small section on this one in a second. We'll talk about this design, but this one was actually the closest design where trains actually were almost competitive. So, and well, I'll break that down actually. Let's just dive into that. Let's just go immediately into that particular design. So this is a design that was designed by you. There's a lot of trains going on in this particular map. In fact, these are giant trains. These have a total of, how many cargo wagons is this? Let me look at it. 18 legendary cargo wagons. Legendary cargo wagons are for the memes. There is no such point, but I think it's out of protest purely because we don't have legendary cargo wagons. If we did and they scaled the same way, we could have just absolutely large inventories in here that we could constantly be pulling items out of, and they'd be a very large buffer. And I understand why they don't exist today because of the technical challenges around going and upgrading them, which is kind of hard to do when the trains are moving, and I think there's some technical limitations to that. But something I'd love to see in 2.1 is a legendary train. I'd love to bring trains back. But this is the first design that actually almost makes them competitive. One of the things that this design does that I really liked is just how quickly it loads the stone into the cargo wagons. I measured it. It takes 3 ticks at 10,000 mining prod level and 4 ticks at 8,000, which is what we are currently running this particular design at. So these almost instantly load up, and that's actually reflected by the choice that was made by you here for going and setting on. Actually, I got to go to the schedule here. You can see that this says 0 seconds past. I guess technically, actually, what's going on is 0.2 seconds, and you was saying that this is actually stored by the game. It just displays always as 0, and so so I thought that was kind of cool. I didn't know you could do that with trains, but the wagons themselves actually just stop for like a very short amount of time at the first stone section, load up the first amount of stone that it needs, then goes to the second section, loads up the second round, and then just continues and moves on. There's a couple clever things that I found cool about this design. One, you're going to see that there's a little filtered inventory slot on these, and you're seeing that here where there's one slot for steel. Why does that exist? Well, what you did that I thought was cool is a few things here. One, using still the cargo wagon as a chest to pass items across like this, and then setting filters on the inserters on or off based on if there happens to be a train currently in the station for that. Now, so on one side is passing through steel, the other side is passing through iron sticks. And that is then copy and pasted across. Now, unfortunately, there's 0 clocking going on here, so there's a potential that if you actually clock this build, this could actually be performing above the baseline. So that's a challenge that I have for you for next time you could go and actually clock this if you wanted to. And specifically, I know we also talked about it offline. There was a concept of we could have potentially modded in legendary trains just to see the difference. I think we can go and try that when we get to another item that's going to have a lot of throughput, which is going to be coal, and that's going to be when we get to military science, so you'll have another chance when we get to that point. But moving on, one of the things I thought was cool is using actually something that I never have used, which is reading the signals from a rail signal here. And whenever it happens to be red like this, that's when it will send across it all of the iron sticks, steel, and stone as the filters for all of these items here. And in that way, I think what this does is you can not have the items ever get stuck when the train is moving, but also completely deactivates them when the train isn't there. So it has kind of that impact and that effect. So here, right here, you can see that this is kind of like right now running out of that material, and it will completely stop trying to pull items out of it and then allow the train to keep moving. So didn't exactly ask all the reasoning, but that's kind of my assumption, and that might be wrong. But this does continuously produce all the materials, actually handled all the tests that I threw at it. And yeah, so performed actually really well. I was surprised that we actually had one where trains were slightly competitive, even though we had to use a 16 stacker train to do it, and you need legendary fuel to do it. But, you know, it's close to being the baseline. To be fair, like I said, the baseline is belting steel, and that is a downside to my particular design. And it's actually the main reason that all the other designs wound up performing better than the baseline that I wound up creating. So as for the rest of the designs, like I was saying, the baseline, the reason immediately when I talked about in the beginning that the first improvement you could make over the baseline was not belting steel, well, every single design didn't do that. They recognized that you shouldn't do that, and they made that improvement. And so that's what you're seeing. Everything that performed above the baseline did not belt steel or use trains. So this leaves me kind of in a predicament. I would normally, at this point in the competition, I'd have 4 or 5 designs that perform below the baseline, and I can go in and compare those. I don't have that today. So there's a couple reasons that I don't think it's going to be fair for me to do a full detailed analysis on all these designs. One of those is that the period of oscillation on these designs are different depending on the approach that was taken. So, as an example, the design that you're seeing, number 16 by T's, that's over here, this design specifically right here. This design, if I go and open up Factorio and look at it, one of the things that it has, or at least the way that it functions, is it is a very different approach to all the rest of the designs, where it's kind of gone away from the blade approach that we've taken. And by blade, what I mean by that is take raw inputs, feed the raw inputs in, and then produce the final output that you need, exactly making the amount of items you need to supply exactly the output here. So whether that's 240 per second, 480 per second, 960 per second, 720, whatever the value is that you've chosen. So in this particular case, what Tease did is very different in the sense that it is all centered around individual modules that you can copy and paste for the items that you wind up needing. So in this case, it's red circuits, and it goes and creates all of those and copies and pastes it enough times and connects all of them into one network, and then just says, okay, cool, turn them on or turn them off. And you're seeing right now that they're actually dormant completely. And so you'll see these large dips where there is no production at all, and then all of a sudden everything starts up. And it does that by reading the belt's contents, and if it ever backs up, and you're seeing that here with the belt content being red, the moment that it backs up, it actually stops that particular module. So when it stops producing at that point, then you're going to have a very large period where you're going to have better entity update time because there isn't very much going on during that particular time because the whole entire build stops. So there's a module for red circuits here. There is a module here that is belting in stone to feed actually the furnaces, and you can actually see this whole thing is stopped right now. And you're seeing also for that reason that stone consumption is way down. All of a sudden then it will start back up again, and the way that it does it is the same thing again. It's using the read and hold all belts on this particular belt, and whenever it goes below a certain threshold, it has an RS latch that will turn on and then turn back off to keep things between 60 and 80 items on that belt. And the moment that it fully blocks or completely blocks and gets to the point where it's completely full again, it will completely stop, and it doesn't shut down just this module, it shuts down the entire assembly. So for that reason, since the benchmarks that I've run for this particular run are 18,000 ticks, and for 6 runs, that means that over the course of a 5-minute period, if we look at this, you're going to see that it's very dependent on when you start and stop the entire build. So if I go a little bit forward into the future here, where we get to the point where this is 5 minutes ago, and let's pause this. What you'll see here is that if let's say I start the benchmark exactly on this line. If I started here, or even worse, if I started a little bit further back, I'm going to have a very large period in the sample where there is nothing going on. This whole period of oscillation is around 45 seconds. So that means that over the course of a 5-minute benchmark, which is what I ran, you're going to have, if you start right here, the benchmark, you're going to have more periods where you have a low entity update time compared to the maximum entity update time that you're going to see at the peak here. So you can see that actually kind of perfectly here with a 5-minute window. You're going to have this start period, and it would end just as it's getting to the peak, but you're going to miss out this large, you think about calculus, the area under the curve where the production is happening. So this is where there's going to be a lot of, this whole section here is where entity update time spikes. And you can see that also by the UPS numbers that are up on the corner of the screen. Right now, you'll see this oscillate between 350 UPS up to 600 UPS. And it totally depends on if you are in the low period or the high period. So that happening is going to drastically impact the design itself. So that's why I don't think it's fair right now to compare all these designs, given that several of them have these latches that are built in to start and stop production. So at a minimum for me, what I'm going to do is I'm going to run these for a full hour to get an entire concept of like how much they're taking over the full hour, because that should smooth this out. Because if you look at like an hour period, eventually these are going to get to the point where this is going to look more and more and more like a straight line, and then you're going to have a lot more of those samples, right? Whereas in a 5-minute period, those 45-second little humps there are only going to be like 6 or so samples of the whole thing, and there's a very high likelihood that you're going to have a large entity update time period that is going to be where you're missing a large area under the curve, and you're not going to get a good enough data. So we do need to run them longer. So that's the first reason why I think that we're going to need to run these a little bit longer for me to get a final actual comparison. A second thing, just quick note on this design, I realized that I made a mistake, and that's on me, is that I forgot to add an extra power pole here. This just wasn't included in the design. A lot of designers, and this is makes total sense, when you're designing something, you work with Global Electric Network turned on, And so for that, when that happens is when I'm running them, I wanted a more accurate simulation of the power draw. So I turned it off, and that's where you wind up seeing that, like, I wind up missing just that there needed to be an extra power pull here. I've gone now, as of recording this, I realized that as I was just going to go and talk about it just now, that I need to go back and do that. So I'll do that for the final baseline, or the final, the next round of the benchmarks I'm going to run for the full 1 hour, is just make sure that every single thing has power, and confirm that on the rest of the designs. And I'll go and fix those. Now, a couple things that I want to talk about before I go back to the results is this design stood out to me in a specific way, in that this breaks from the traditional pattern of always designing with a blade in mind. I like the design style of going and just starting with raw inputs and then creating the final output. But specifically when we start talking about a kind of on-patch solution that's like this, this seems to me in a lot of ways like a slightly more accurate way of how you would go about designing something that's on patch. Is kind of having these outposts that produce the purple signs that you need on like a default patch setting if you're constraining yourself to 100% patch sizes. I don't, but if you do, this makes a lot of sense just from a logistics standpoint. You wind up having all these patches here that are outposts producing the signs, and then they belt back to the main hub where all your signs are actually getting processed. And then you don't have to route across the whole map all the fluids that you wind up needing, or coal that you wind up needing, etc. So it makes it a little bit easier, because you just have to belt 2 highly dense items across the map, which is the productivity modules and then the steel furnace themselves. These are the densest items that you can have, just because of the sheer quantity of resources that are required to go and produce just one productivity module, right? So because we wind up seeing like, okay, I take the 5 red circuits and 5 green circuits that I have to belt all the way across the map, or their raw fluid inputs and stuff in coal, and I can just I can take the 5-to-1 reduction. I'm excluding the 50% productivity inherently from electromagnetic plants, but just to simplify it, I can run 1 belt instead of 5, right? So, or 10, instead of 10 belts, I could be running just 1 belt of productivity modules, right? So that's the way that I would wind up kind of describing this, is that it's nice to belt the highly dense items. It's one of the things I do in Gleba. I belt the fruits, or I train actually the fruits in and belt just that, and then all the byproducts, everything are produced on site with direct insertion. So it's a nice strategy for this particular design philosophy, and I don't want to rule it out, because it's a way for us to be able to, like, because I want to kind of challenge the status quo. Like, are we going about it the correct way right now by doing everything from raw resources and belting those in? I think in the case of stone, it's clearly showing that there is a benefit to doing on patch. And in what case do you want to do it? So this design is kind of an interesting concept, because it combines a hybrid of solutions. And this is actually the reason why I'm just combining all the 100% designs into just an any percent. And the ones that purely use belt only will have their own category, just for that being a different design philosophy as itself. Because like I said, this is all logistics. It's a logistics problem. It's not just a UPS problem once you start doing things on patch at 100% settings. When you go to 600% settings, all those logistics problems kind of go out the window, and you can just easily just stamp the whole thing onto 1 patch and you're good. So that's the first part of where I'm thinking of how we're going to approach this, and why I want to take this a little bit slower and not just rush into just analyzing all the designs right away, and rather just give you a holistic picture of some of the trade-offs that you're going to make. The way that I want to approach this competition that's going to be different than the other ones is we're not going to have 1 final design or 2 final designs that can be used interchangeably. They're going to be the best designs for that particular science. What we're going to do is we're going to break this down a little bit, depending on the style that you choose to play the game. So if you want to use an all belted design, then you can choose from pretty much almost all the designs from 17 down are all going to work for fully belting. So we have the largest sample there. And in fact, actually, if you look at the full designs here, let's go and look at that here. These are all the any percent designs. They are either using a hybrid like 16 by Tease is using. You're seeing then there's going to be ones that are fully on patch, which is number 19, 6, 2, and 28. And then 17 and then 21 down are all going to be just purely belted designs. So depending on your style and what you want to do specifically, you could choose from the category of purely belted designs. You could choose from the ones that are the patch design, or you could use a hybrid that T's wound up creating. And so for that reason, I want to compare these and focus the most on these, because I think this is where we're going to get the most valuable data from, because mainly just because of the sample size, just how many designs that we have for this competition. The vast majority are all in the any percent category. And then also we'll take these designs. So we'll have one that's the best any percent, the best belted, the best, on patch, and we'll have a bunch of different variants that we can use just in the any percent category. Then if you're like me and you don't care about the patch size setting, then cool, go for the 200% plus, because that's where we're going to see, that's where we're going to have the best designs, because they can have the most amount of beacon sharing, the most, just like everything can be on one patch, and this simplifies the logistics problem significantly. So that's how I run mega bases. I'm like, I don't care, just give me whatever the game can give me, and I will just go for the maximum that I can get with the largest patch sizes that are available. And that's how a lot of mega bases have done it in the past. But if you don't want to run it that way, that's completely fine. That's up to you. So that's how I'm going to approach this. And we'll have more of a deep breakdown into each individual designs in the next videos that are to come. So stick around for that. What I'm going to do next is I'm going to say, okay, out of the designs right now, given that we have just purely preliminary results, are there any correlations that we can derive from the purely belted only designs, ones from the entirety? And let's go and do a look into that. So what I've done is I have gone, and not only do I have included all of the blueprints that are available, so like, again, you can go to the README, you can copy those. I wound up also creating a map copy of the exact save file that was sent to me. And I wound up going and saying, okay, let me go and create a full blueprint of that so that I can cross-reference and count all the entities that are in each individual design. So that's what we've done. So for example, you can go here and you can look at this baseline design, and you can see a lot of the metrics that are available for each of these individual blueprints. So I have a script that I've created that goes through and reads a blueprint file, and then we'll figure out where an inserter is dropping items from, dropping to, is it controlled, what is it doing, right? So, and then also computes other things that you might intuitively think is going to matter, and then we can see if it matters at all. So for example, the total number of beacons that you have, the beacons per rail recipe, in this case, there's just 2 beacons for that. The beacons per chemical plant, per electric furnace, and then even down to the recipe. So if it's making advanced circuit recipe, like, how many beacons do you have on the red circuit build? How many beacons do you have per foundry on average, or the foundry specifically that's making copper cables, or etc. So those are all derived, and these are actually computed for all 30 designs, so that we get finally a full aggregate of all the designs, all of their counts, so that we can do really nice things. Like in here, I can go and I can say, cool, let me count the number of beacons per assembly machine 3 that is producing production science packs. Cool, the baseline used 7, Geist used 10, 10, 10, and what do I mean by that specifically? Well, if you go over here to Factorial, let me go and load up, for example, since I just pointed out Geist design, let me go open up Geist design, and we will go and showcase that. So if you look at this here, we can see that the number of beacons here is 10. And if we look back at VS Code, you're going to see that the beacons are, for Geist's number 1 design, also 10. So it looks at the proximity of the beacon, what it happens to be touching, and then you can get other ratios and things like the number of buildings to beacon count. And so there's these average buildings. So in this case, the baseline design has a very low building per beacon. So a lot of extra beacons, for example, and Geist has a lot more beacon sharing, for example. And you can kind of see that because that's kind of an indicator. So the higher the number is, that means that the better the actual beacons are being utilized. And so kind of interesting metrics that you can look at. Again, all this is available on my GitHub. You can just look at all these values. Why do we compute this? Okay, So in the chemical sciences series, I did for the first time metric correlations. So go back and look at that. High level, all it means is we are just going to try to correlate a value, like the number of beacons that we have, and see if it happens to line up with any of these other metrics. So entity update time, control behavior update time, transport line update time, etc. Small segue or side note, I really, really, really wish that the entity update time, the largest category in all these, was actually broken down by entity type. We don't have that available, and Factorio itself, the command that we're using, which is the --benchmark command, or the -benchmark command, when you run the benchmark from Factorio itself, it only gives you the overall aggregate stats. It gives you a lot of stats, but the stats that I would love to see, and I actually have a feature request for the devs to eventually do this, is I would love to have, if I go and press F4 here and I show the entity time usage, I would love for these statistics here, the assembly machine update time, the furnace update time, infinity container, for example, infinity pipes, inserters. I would love to have these statistics per tick emitted to the benchmark so that I can see the breakdown of the mining drills update time, the inserters update time, the furnaces, etc. in these benchmarks, because it'd be really interesting to know, like, even on a per tick or just over the entire course of this, if we could take that large total entity update time and have it, like, let's say an other category for all the things that are not captured in here. Okay, cool, whatever. But then having it so that it displays the specific timing for the assembly machine, the inserters, that would be so insightful for us in megabasing to be able to look at that and know exactly how much time was actually used by inserters, because that could be used to correlate which designs made better choices for inserters, like clocking, etc. So because of that limitation that exists, what that means for us is that the only thing that I can actually derive correlations from is the giant black box of all total entity update time. That's probably all that really matters, but it would help us to quickly drive down, like, okay, this person did better inserter clocking, this person had like a better like choice that they made with the number of assembly machines, what they're doing, start, stops, etc. So would immediately drive those. So with all that being said, when I'm creating the correlations I'm going to showcase here next, they're done purely on the total entity update time, the total train update time, transport line update time, control behavior time, etc. So we don't get that detailed breakdown, unfortunately. At least not yet. Maybe they'll honor the feature request one day. Now, trains is actually funny because trains are technically an entity, I think. But when you use them as a chest, for example, you see them here, right? Like from Reitberg using that to the trains, or from Moulin using the trains here as just a chest, not actually using the trains in the way that they're intended to. So if you actually broke it down, you could see that, like, okay, if the trains were just swallowed up in total entity update time, you'd never get the correlations that you get with trains. So anyway, just pointing that out, that it would be cool to see those other update times. All right, let's go into the correlations. What are correlations? Correlations are, let's take a metric like train update time, entity update time, and associate it with the number of entity counts or a inserter doing something very specific, like pulling from, like, let's pick something really, really specific here for a stack inserter from a cargo wagon to a turbo transport belt, or all inserters that are pulling from a chemical plant with producing plastic bars to a cargo wagon, for example. And this can be also direct insertion, etc. So there's all those categories are defined, and does that impact the entity update time, and how much of an impact does it have? So there's different ranges. So we're going to be, basically, to keep this very simple, we're just going to say if it has very high impact, or it overall correlation, we're going to care about it. And it also, if it has a high impact, we're going to care about it. We're not going to care about the lows. So for example, a low correlation would be the fact that you happen to have more decider combinators impacts your whole update time. That's not going to be necessarily the case. We know that's not true. So those are going to be omitted because that's not a high correlation. This is a less than like 50% or 0.5 correlation. That's really, really low. That's not worth us actually going and looking at it. So let's look at just the ones that are going to be in the high or very high range, because that's going to give us a higher confidence. So right off the bat, a very obvious one that comes about is curved rails impact trains. Well, that's not obvious. Well, okay. Because we know that used design is the only one that actually used curved rails, this makes sense that it would think that the train update time is going to come from that. Where it's really coming from is the locomotives that are constantly running all the time. And that's why in the entire train category here, pretty much everything that you're seeing here is all based on used design. So using rail signals, using fast inserters, like using actually a pump jack is the only one that I didn't go and remove it for having an infinity pipe associated with it, but the pump jack didn't show up for anything else. Had a small entity update time associated with it, so it's not that big of a deal. But like these are all things that are that are using that has a high impact. So we're going to ignore the train metric altogether, and let's look at the ones that we care about. Again, we're looking at all designs here, and then we'll focus specifically on the belted one because I think we find some more meaningful correlations from there. So the first one is pretty obvious here. So the highest correlation is the beacon count electric network update time. That's nothing new. That we've seen that in other series before. It's nice to see that that's confirmed, but it makes sense. More beacons you have, the higher electric network update time is going to be there. But it's a very small impact, which we've seen before. So like the one that we really care about is entity update time. Otherwise, control behavior update time, we'll cover, let me go to foundries real quick just to touch on it. Makes sense. We've talked about this in the past, but in case you missed it, the more foundries you have, or the more just buildings in general, the number of pipes you have, the number of buildings that you have in general connected to the fluid network is going to increase your fluid flow update time. It makes total sense that that's the case. The more buildings you have connected to the fluid network, the higher that's going to go. That's a high correlation. So the more foundries you have, the higher that's going to be. Control behavior update time impacts some CPUs more than others, so you may care about this more. But out of all the designs where it wound up seeing it the most was the number of inserters that had direct insertion with circuit being enabled, so on or off control. That's where we had the highest control behavior update time was on the number of inserters that happened to have direct insertion and were circuit enabled. So it's something I'd like to explore. Maybe it's not worth it in some cases for Purple Science to just even care at all about clocking things. So, but again, what we care about is the overall balance. We don't care about it just impacting control behavior update time. We care about the whole update time in its entirety. Now, do we have anything that actually impacts the whole update time that we have a high confidence in? Well, seems like we have at least a high confidence in these. So the number of inserters going to an electric furnace. Now, the only electric furnaces we have are for smelting bricks. So the more, by essence, you would think then the more the electric furnaces you have, the worse it's going to be. But because we have direct insertion of going and not always having the inserter update time. So what we're seeing here, where I'm going with this, is that the inserters, and the only thing they're pulling on is stone. So across all the designs, the number of inserters you had shoving stone into an electric furnace had an impact to increasing the whole update time as a whole. The number of then inserters that are coming from a foundry casting steel to a cargo wagon, well, what's the only design that did that? That's the baseline. So yeah, it makes sense that belting steel is bad for the whole update time. And that is confirmed here. So that makes sense. That's why all the designs did better than the baseline by a large margin, and it confirms it here that the category is saying, yeah, don't belt steel is basically what this is saying. So that, anyway, interesting metrics overall, like that kind of shows the whole update time. Now, the entity update time is interesting to me because that's the biggest category. We didn't get a lot of correlations. Again, like I wish we had a breakdown for that where we actually had a breakout of each individual entity stat itself. Then we could get better correlations for these things. But alas, we don't have it. So we're just going to try to look into the black box of entity update time and guess. And that's the best that this statistics algorithm can do that I wrote. So it's just basic correlation statistics stuff, but so it's nothing super fancy. But anyway, so the entity update time here is all the inserters that are coming from a belt has the highest correlation. So it's going to be steel, stone, anything pulling up from a belt It didn't say specifically going to anywhere, but it does say the inserters that are going to an electric furnace, right? So that are going to that at a high entity update time cost. So now it isn't specifically calling out if they happen to be clocked or not. It's just the number of inserters in general going to electric furnace had a higher impact. So we might be able to reduce that by clocking those, and some of them don't clock it, so that's a thing. But we'll do that once we have the longer benchmarks, and we can get more into the breakdown of that and see these correlations hold up once we have the longer benchmarks. Then the other one that I thought was interesting is like the number of turbo underground belts that you have increases your entity update time. I don't think that makes any sense. That shouldn't be the case, but I'm wondering if it's more of like the stack inserters pulling from an underground belt. I don't know. I have to look. Like, this seems like just like this makes no sense at all. So, and then also the other one that makes sense is the inserters that are dropping to a belt, and the number of stack inserters you have doing that in general is going to increase the entity update time. So again, it's all inserters and belts. Everything is inserter control for this, at least across all the designs. Now, this is all designs, and there isn't a lot to compare. So where it gets more interesting is when you get into correlations for a specific design type. Okay, so now moving on to the belted correlations. So these are all designs where there happen to be a core, like we're looking for correlations for the designs that specifically are belting in stone. This is a little bit more useful because now we're going to get a more like for like comparison, because we're removing the known factor that direct mining into the rail assemblage is going to be better. So we're eliminating that from the possibility, and this is just comparing the similar design strategies. So I'm going to go ahead and immediately remove trains, because we understand that cargo wagons, just using them as chests, is going to increase your train update time. So that's not that useful. And I think the things that I'm interested in is control behavior update time, entity update time, and whole update time. Now, control behavior update time had the gist of what it's saying is, hey, you have a higher control behavior update time when you happen to be using direct insertion. That just means that you have more inserters that you're using. Therefore, your control behavior update time is going to go up if you happen to be clocking them. So that makes sense. In general, that clocking with direct insertion is going to have a higher impact on control behavior update time, just sheerly due to the number of inserters that you're using. So that's just, and again, just shows up here. The more stack inserters that you happen to be circuit controlling, the higher your control behavior update time is going to be there. Don't care about that as much on my particular CPU, because my CPU benefits significantly from the circuit network because of the additional threads that it has. So, but on your machine, if you are having a hard time with multi-threading, and you may not want control behavior update time if you have a limited number of threads, and you may prefer to just use the waitlist behaviors that already exist. So, and not clocking things. Now, for most part, for megabases, you're going to have a lot of threads. So you should have a machine that's going to be able to do that. That's going to make it better for you to have to hit higher SPM numbers. So for me, I'm not going to care as much about control behavior update time. I'm going to care more about entity update time. So let's go and jump into that. So for entity update time, the first thing it calls out is inserters going from an underground input belt to an assembly machine 3 rail. So that just means an assembly machine making rails, right? So why is it calling out the underground input belt? Why is that a thing that it's calling out as a high correlation? Well, what's really going on is, what this is really describing is a moving belt. Is really what's happening. Now, I can't do that from looking at the actual blueprint, because I don't know if the belt is moving or not from the blueprint, but we know this is for the fact due to a way that the actual inserters work when they're pulling from an underground belt compared to a straight belt. So let me give you a practical example of how that works. So over here in Factorial, I've modeled out specifically the little setup that we have here. So we have a belt that is already fully saturated and is not moving. When it's not moving and we advance ticks manually one at a time, you're going to see that all these inserters finish swinging and come back at the exact same point and can pick up items again and go for the next swing at exactly the same time and all synchronize. And this will work as long as the belt is not moving. And you'll continue to see this pattern continue to go forward. You can go and play this for a while and then move it again forward and backward. If the belt isn't moving whenever they happen to and can fully stop, then the legendary stack inserters will always come back to the same point. So cool, belt's not moving. However, in most designs, the belt is moving. So let's ignore this case, right? And let me keep those there. Let me move this here so it's all moving, and then let's delete all of these inserters in their chests. Let's have the belt moving. Cool. Pause the game. Belt moving is simulating you're consuming constantly from the belt. Like you're at full max capacity of the belt's consumption rate. When this happens, you're going to see a different behavior that emerges when you're pulling from undergrounds versus pulling from a straight belt. So when you do that, you're going to start to notice that here on a regular straight segment, it completes first before all the undergrounds. Then 1 tick, 2 ticks later, all the undergrounds finish. So that means that you have 2 ticks extra that the stack inserters are going to be enabled purely just because they happen to be pulling from an underground that happens to be moving. In my baseline build, I made this error where I have a constant or almost constantly moving belt here of stone and steel, and these are constantly picking up from it and going directly into this assembly machine 3 here, this crafting rails. So even though I clock it technically, it doesn't make a big of a difference because this needs to be almost at the full speed of these inserters, and they need, in order to produce basically this is almost exactly a ratio, this needs over the amount that a belt can actually supply. So that's why I'm even feeding this in with a turbo splitter belt. So a lot of decisions here are just bad because it's constantly picking up from an underground belt. So we're not going to be able to benefit from the optimization that you can get from being able to pick up directly from this turbo transport belt here. So again, other designs wound up doing this as well. So any of them that are picking up from a moving belt and from an underground that is moving are going to have that 2 tick extra penalty that they're going to have, and the inserter cost is just going to be higher. So you're going to see that then across these designs that these inserters are just going to be on and active longer because they're pulling from the underground belts that happen to be moving. So that's a thing that the correlations picked up when we looked at it, which I thought was kind of an interesting thing. Now, at this point, you might be saying, all right, hold on, A-Buck. At this point, you're just comparing the baseline to all of them. It's all steel-based. So, okay, I hear you on that. So let's just remove the baseline altogether and just focus on just the designs that were doing belting. Okay, so in that case, the underground thing goes away. So that makes sense that kind of happens because that was the biggest drawback to that particular design. But now that you know that fun fact, let's move on. So the items that get called out for entity update time is the inserters that are coming from a foundry that is casting steel to an assembly machine 3 that is making electric furnaces. The number of inserters that you had, and conversely, the number of buildings that you had that happened to be making electric furnaces wound up going up. Now, actually, to be fair, it doesn't call out here that the number of electric furnace assembly machines went up. There's a number that used double inserters to go directly into an assembly machine 3. And so in those cases, it seems like it wasn't worth to do that, and just using one inserter was enough to go and craft that. So that's like a call out. So we'll see if that continues to hold up with the longer tests, but that's an interesting one initially that it winds up saying. The whole update time is also introduced from the same reason, is it saying that, hey, that was another reason that is considered to be there. So it seems like it's, at least initially, it's not worth it having the extra ones just to over insert and get higher insertion throughput there. So the next thing that it kind of, again, then just kind of calls out is those are the only things that it's saying is just with the electric furnaces. So there must be an outlier that's in there that's doing this. And then otherwise, there's the control behavior update time is for the production science pack when it's circuit enabled. So that makes sense that that's going to be higher. And I'm assuming that a lot of these designs, as I've been looking to them, may not have exactly perfect clocking. So by not exactly clocking it perfectly, you're going to have more control behavior update time hits. And I know that a few of these designs specifically have their stack size set to 12 or 8 that are belted. So that's where it might be saying, hey, you're going to have higher control behavior update time because you're sending more pulses for those specifically when they have to be circuit enabled. Now, that might be a correlation that it winds up seeing, but again, this is getting lower and lower in terms of the actual correlations there. Now, on patch is where it gets a little bit more interesting. This is just the strictly fully on patch designs where there is no kind of hybrid approach where you're belting stone at least. The first call out that it has is the number of electric furnaces you have increases it. So that makes sense. At the 600% mark, you can have less electric furnaces because you can get more beacons around them and share more on a bigger patch. That makes total sense. So that's the benefit there, and that's what we're probably going to see in the longer benchmarks and as we get into the detailed design breakdowns in the future videos. The next thing it's saying is like the inserters that are going from an electric furnace that are circuit enabled. So the more inserters you have, which also comes into corresponds with how many electric furnaces you have. So that makes total sense. So both of those are going to impact the whole update time. Now, one that I thought was interesting is where it was talking about here that are going to a let me find this one here. So the second one that I found was interesting is this metric that it's saying that there's an inserter going from an electric furnace to a turbo transport belt. And I said, well, these are all direct insertion builds. Why would you have this metric as a call out? Because you shouldn't be going from the electric furnace. You should probably be directly inserting. But why are we belting anything? Well, there's one design specifically that is belting something, and that is this design right here. So this is a design that is made by Rydberg. And the choice here was to fit as much as we could on only one patch. So for that reason, there are coming from a furnace here, we are unloading the stone bricks onto a belt. And then that is being belted down to the location where the electric furnaces are actually getting crafted. So then as this is moving, you're seeing that this is a pretty high throughput rate. You could, in essence, you can just have one constantly running just all the time, but I think just so that the belt isn't moving and can completely stop, the two inserters are being used here, at least for this end, can benefit from the belt actually stopping. But this belt can't actually fully stop when it gets to the point where both of these are pulling off, just because of this the throughput rate here. Because both of these are going to require a little bit over that to get, and this is going to probably be underclocked, right, to only, yeah, it is, to only make 10 per second. But that's the call out that it's finding is like, hey, your overall whole update time went up because of belting here, in this case, the actual stone bricks, instead of directly smelting it on site and inserting it directly into the machine. So that makes sense overall that that's the case, because if you look at just the designs that are, pull this up over here. If you look at just the designs that correlate for the on-patch designs, you can see that Rydberg's design was a good chunk behind. And so compared to some of the other ones that are at 600%. So these are the other designs there. And at least, again, this is rudimentary, like initial tests that we're doing. But I think that entity update time is being consumed again by just, that's a contributing factor is those inserters. And that's what the overall rubric, or not the rubric, the correlations are picking up as well. So it seems like that's also something. So in general, what we're kind of seeing now as a trend is any items that are high flow rate items. So in we can even let's not even look at this. Let's go back over to Factorial, explain that. So any high flow rate items, so that's going to be the non-compressed items. So your stone bricks are going to be one of those. Red circuits are not as much. They're 58 per second, but still kind of high in terms of the number that you're going to need. It seems like, but double that, right, is going to be steel and stone bricks. So in general, steel is the highest flow through item. Stone is the highest. Productivity kind of helps because that winds up then breaking down the stone consumption into bricks. But when you look at the, I guess you're going to get like a, per stone that you're going to wind up smelting into a brick, you're going to wind up getting, it's going to take 2 stone to go and create one brick, and then with productivity, that's going to get you 1.5, right? That's 50% prod. So it is more compressed than the stone itself, so it is slightly better to belt that, but still, the ability you really only need, if you can beacon this properly, you should be able to get 2 furnaces to directly insert into one of these assembly machine 3s making this, and you should be able to keep up with the actual demand if you're running constantly that furnace, and you can't actually get it if you place it just properly. So that is another kind of a choice that could be made to reduce the number of inserters that are interacting with the belt, and overall benefit from the 600% that you get when you go to this large size here. So that's, I believe, is what we're going to see as a differentiator, but we'll see when we get into more of the detailed breakdown. So a little bit farther in the future, but and I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but those are some of the correlations that I'm seeing. So in a nutshell, at a high level, where we're kind of at right now is the name of the game is reducing transfers that are happening, especially transfers from a belt. And I think the simplest way to think about what we should be optimizing in these larger builds is reducing high flow rate items or high transfers from a belt. Belting highly compressed items that are very low consumption rate, like in the example here where we're consuming productivity modules and electric furnaces, highly compressed dense items, totally fine to pick up from a belt. But that's a good reason why you should not at all belt the actual rails, because of just they double the amount of items that are coming in, right? So that's in the highest flow rate item. So that one made total sense for direct insertion. Everyone chose that. It's the same reason you shouldn't be belting steel, same reason you shouldn't be belting stone, same reason you should get the idea. So I think that that's where the trade-off is going to kind of come from in terms of direct insertion versus when you are going to be belting a material is based on how dense it is, and then the consumption rate of that item, and also the speed of the machine. So reducing high flow rate items on a belt is going to be just a beneficial thing for all these designs as like a total philosophy, regardless of the actual science that we're creating. I think that is, I can confidently say at this point, after going through all this series so far, that's definitely my immediate takeaway, and that's been corresponded by all the correlations across all the different design types and their philosophies on how they approached it. So many different choices that can be made just to improve things. So directly inserting here with an electric mining drill, huge improvement there to help with that. Then not belting steel and directly inserting it is better because of just how high the flow rate item is, and the list goes on. So those are my main takeaways. So if you've made it this far in the video, first off, thank you for your attention span. Thank you for watching this far in the video. And I appreciate you following along in the series if you have been watching it. If you've missed it, watch some of the earlier episodes, or specifically the finales. Those are the ones where we get the most information and where we can get the overall results that are helpful for us for designing these builds here. So the plan for the next videos are, I have a couple different things I'd like to do in my mind. So I'd like to get back with the designers and we can work on some composite designs. So I'd like to come up with some designs that break up individual modules. So I'd love to get to the point where we design some builds that are going to have different modules specifically for productivity module, like making the productivity modules, breaking out the components that are going to be for crafting then the actual furnaces, testing those builds out, and finally testing out. I think those are the two main components that can be taken a little bit away from specifically the patch size itself. The biggest patch size benefit is going to come from this configuration you're seeing on the right, where you have the maximum amount of sharing beacons and also the maximum amount of the rail assemblers. Those are going to benefit probably the most from the stone flow rate that's going to come through. And so this is probably going to be reserved, just that's the patch size you have, and that's going to be, you're going to get a benefit there. So I don't find so much value in testing this whole layout as a whole, but definitely the production of the productivity modules and also the furnaces themselves might be useful in creating kind of more of a hybrid approach, so that's something I'd like to see. The next episode is going to focus on kind of a breakdown of the designs after we have a longer run that's done. And I may break this down into one for the 100% designs and then declare a winner there, and then go into the 600% designs or 200% plus and create the winners that are over there. And then finally create a final video that talks about the hybrid designs and can we make an improvement that gets us even to the final, like the above all the designs that we have here so far, and create like like kind of like not a Frankenstein's monster, but something that's along those lines in terms of a final design that we can all be happy with, that is a full community driven design rather than just individual designs. So that's the plan of what we're going to be doing next. Appreciate you watching this video. I know this was a lot less like Factorio. It's kind of Factorio content related, but I didn't actually show Factorio that much. It was a lot more of showing just the results and the breakdown, and that's how I wanted to approach this particular video. I was having a hard time, frankly, how to give each of the designs the amount of attention that they deserve while balancing the very large deviations in approaches and being able to balance those. So hopefully you found this information insightful and helpful and interesting. So with that, if you want to support the channel, would love for a like on the video. And if you don't mind subscribing, that'd be awesome. But if not, that's totally fine. And you can just keep watching the videos as they are. And like I said, you can always read my analysis and descriptions in the video below and the video comments below, and for the whole results and everything, all the good stuff that you find on GitHub for all the results and analysis that we break down. So more to come. Thank you so much for watching. Again, my name is Abak Nasty, and have a fantastic rest of your day.